It's really great to be here with you guys today. I'm going to be talking about resiliency and progressive web apps. Now, resiliency isn't necessarily a new term in the world of web development. I think a lot of us have heard it in the world of DevOps when we talk about how to prevent downtime or creating robust distributed systems. But if we want to consider how to create consistently available, fluid web experience for our users, we really need to think about resiliency as it applies to the entire development process, even down to the obstacles that users might encounter when they're trying to access the web. But before I get into that, I just want to cover a few bases with progressive web apps and define what it is. We have a few talks in this conference about progressive web apps, which is very exciting. So you'll have a chance to dig into the details a little bit more. But essentially, it's just a checklist of benchmarks that a web app will have in order for it to be considered a progressive web app. So the first one is whether or not it's reliable, meaning that it's available regardless of network environment. So if it's available offline, will your users still be able to consume content and engage with your app? The other one is whether or not it's fast. This is made possible through service workers, just like the offline functionality is made possible through service workers, where we cache certain assets that allow for us to serve up assets regardless of whether or not the connection is slow. So we don't have to load assets more than that first time to get that initial loading going at a blazing speed. And lastly, it should be engaging. So progressive web apps make available certain features that were previously reserved for or only available in native apps. Things like making it available to add to your homepage or push notifications. Things that remind users that your app is still there and that they should be frequenting it regularly. And like I mentioned, a lot of this is made available through service workers, which a quick and dirty definition is that there are web workers that sit between the client and the network that cache assets and distribute. They act as an intermediary, essentially, to cache assets and offer them up to the client when the network is down or the network is slow, allowing for users to have a very fluid experience regardless of what is happening with the network. So going back to the concept of resiliency, as the web is growing, and it is our job to connect our users to the web in all corners of the globe, a lot of these users are accessing the web in environments that are unfamiliar to our own. So it's our job to expand our horizons on how we can understand what context they are accessing the web through and what kind of obstacles they might encounter as they're trying to access our sites or use our products. And so some of these are relatable to us and others are not. Some could be austere context. And what I mean by this is like users that live in a more rugged environment than our own. They have different accesses to resources. They have different external influences on their lives that affect the way that they interact with the internet. And if it's affecting the way they interact with our products, then it's our business to understand what those things are, even if we wouldn't imagine them in our day-to-day lives. The other one is variable environments. This is something that I think we get, and I think we bring up as examples a lot with progressive web apps, where like we might be traveling cross country and go through a dead zone, or we want to work on the train, but the Wi-Fi is really bad, so we can't actually be productive. Or we want to work in Thailand for a month and the internet's very slow, and we feel the pain of these changing environments as we move around the world, but we won't ever really know what it's like to live in a remote village in Nigeria, for example. So it's becoming apparent that the global mobile industry is more interested in providing mobile data to more people in more places than they are in increasing speed for people that already have access to like the 4G network. So what this means for us is that the majority of our user base is going to be accessing the web on vastly different internet speeds than the ones that we develop on. So the average user that's accessing the web for the first time is going to be doing that over a 2G connection. So this should be part of our idea of what an average user looks like as mobile users continue to grow over time. The other one is remote environments. This could be an agricultural scientist who's going to the farmlands to collect information, data from the soil, and wants to be able to use his tools on the go, or a Kenyan pastoralist who wants to keep up to date with the news while he's watching his goats miles away from the nearest settlement. What's important to note about this is that both of these types of users expect to be able to find resources available to them in their day-to-day lives, regardless of whether or not access to internet is still available. So users in Kenya, for example, they might come into contact with the mobile data maybe once a day, but that doesn't mean that their activity stops when they leave the environment where they have access to data. So they'll proactively seek out applications where, in their mind, they can download information that they can then access later. So sometimes it is downloading articles, and other times it's accessing web apps that are available offline for them. The other part is financial resources being limited. So when I was in Kenya, I spent like 3 months last year in Kenya for my job, and I spent what I thought was an exorbitant amount of money on mobile data, and that was within like my own living expenses, like normal budget that I thought was exorbitant. The amount of money that people have to spend on data is going down over time, but it is still very expensive for people, but they will make it a priority. So these numbers were taken from the International Labour Organization in 2016, so it could be a little bit different, but just to give you a bit of context, someone in Brazil making minimum wage might have to work up to 30 hours in order to afford 500 megabytes of data. So this means that their purchase of and usage of data is incredibly budgeted. So they're going to be very conscientious of how much money is going into their data and then what they're going to be using that data on. So that doesn't necessarily mean that their user behaviors of what they check and what they access change. Like users tend to gravitate towards the apps that they want, regardless of how much access to megabytes that they have. But they will be very careful as to what it is that they're going to be spending that money on. The other part of it is that they're not going to be able to buy the same phones that we use. So they'll be buying low-end or old smartphones. And these are known for having low RAM and low memory. In India, 30% of smartphone users run out of storage by the end of every day. So what that means is that if they have to access 5 apps in a day and they only have room for 4, they're going to delete one app to make room for the other, which is really bad news if our app is the one that's getting deleted for them to be able to, I don't know, check their bank account in that moment. And then we just hope that they think of us again when they have available space for us. We don't want to force users to have to make these types of concessions, which they do on a regular basis. The third one is a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart, which is active obstructions. So I think we have all heard in the news about governments shutting down the internet or blocking certain sites. And I wanted to understand at a deeper level what this actually meant for the builders of the web, if there's any way that our understanding of these circumstances could affect the way that we think about progressive web apps or the way we interact with our own development process. So it turns out that there's 3 different types of shutdowns. The first one, there's very little that we can do about it. These are countries where the government has basically entire control of the of providers, or there's only like a handful of ISPs that they can bully into literally unplugging the internet. This doesn't happen very regularly because it's incredibly expensive. Once the country goes dark, it goes dark for everybody, and it kind of slows down the economy. So if you have a country that has an economy that depends on the internet, this won't happen for very long or won't happen very often. There are countries that do this regularly, but they are countries that are very happy to live in the dark, and they just live in a completely different era. And we wouldn't be really talking about users that are used to working with the web on a regular basis anyway. So there's not a lot of data points to collect on these places anyway. The next one is something that I think makes the news the most. It's, I think, the most volatile way to address controlling users' access to the web, which is when you block a site. Now, research has shown that this isn't very effective. It's not useful in really deterring users from accessing the web, because what happens is after you block it for the first time, people will just download a VPN and access whatever app they want from a neighboring country. So this happens regularly, but there's not much that we as web developers can do about it that isn't already underway. I think a lot of times it's really like a wow factor for the government to show that they have control over these types of things. And the third type is something that is well within our area of interest, which is bandwidth throttling. So this is when governments will slow down either a site or internet for certain geographical regions in order to control their usage of it or their perception of a site. So, for example, in Sudan, there was it was a peaceful protest. There was an election, and the youth were trying to advocate for a peaceful transition of power. And they were conducting a sit-in, and they were being incredibly strategic about how to use mobile platforms to alert the global community as to what was happening and what they're trying out to see if it could be productive for them, and to communicate and to coordinate amongst each other what they're going to do. Now, leading up to this, the government was actively throttling the internet so that it would be much harder for them to coordinate activities. And then they ended up blocking a bunch of sites, and the country went dark for a bit, and that's when they had their crackdown. So a few weeks later, we woke up to the news of the atrocities that the government conducted in order to actually deter these protesters from making any more momentum than they already had. Kazakhstan has on and off for, I think, every time they have elections, they actively throttle sites of news outlets that cover any political opponents. And they'll also, anytime a political opponent will get online to speak, they'll throttle different sites where people are having conversations about it. Now, throttling is super subtle for people. A lot of people don't know that it's a thing, so they can't keep an eye out for whether or not this is a deterrent that's being placed on them. So people might not be aware of this candidate. They might not be aware that there's actually news sites, because they might go to a site, lose patience that it's so slow, and then just go to the government site where the preferred candidate has all of the coverage and is very easy to interact with them. It's also a way for governments to try to direct users into using specific platforms. So they might have Facebook might be incredibly slow in their country, but the government version of it is not. And so users don't think that the government's pushing them in the direction of a site that's heavily surveilled, but in fact that they are. What's interesting is that the combination of blocking and throttling is the most potent. So if you throttle a site and then you block it, people will be less enraged and try to find a VPN or try to jump the firewall, so to speak. They'll just have been so frustrated in trying to access that site that they'll say, okay, now it's blocked, whatever, I already have my alternative. So finding some good stats on this is really difficult because it's very difficult for people to detect and to report on. But while I was doing my research, the countries that you would expect came up most frequently in examples of proactive throttling. And it turns out that it highly correlates with their internet freedom scores. So the question is, what is it that we can do to affect the way that people, what kind of freedom people have with the internet? Now, we have our native apps, but progressive web apps allow users to access a site on any device with any browser in any type of condition. So like native, it will allow for offline functionality. It'll allow for fast load times, which is crucial in the perception of being connected. A lot of this is about people feeling like they're connected regardless of what kind of network conditions are in existence at that time. And we can have more user engagement, so they don't have to have as many hurdles to access the web if they're, or your particular site if it's already on their home screen. But in addition to all of that, there's a low barrier to entry, both for developers and for users as well, because you don't have to go to the App Store, even though App Stores have a lot of benefit in their own right. There's no reason not to add a progressive web app to your phone or your tablet, whatever your device is. And for developers, as a web developer myself, I find it incredibly encouraging that I can just augment the projects I'm working on by mastering service workers and adding some design features to create a native-like experience. And so if you're managing a project and you're trying to decide where to put your resources, do you make a web app and a native app? With progressive web apps, you don't have to choose. You can just extend your web app into the progressive web app world, and you get a lot of benefits from that. It's fresh in the sense that you don't have to wait for the next update. All you have to do is push to prod, and given that your service workers are refreshing as they should, users can get the next version of your app. So iterating quickly is really great, especially if you're trying to understand user needs and you're trying to cater to a new user group. This is really useful and making very quick iterations on your product. It's very light. It's lighter than a native app in many instances. So you'll see some companies will have both a native app and a progressive web app, like Twitter, for example. I think a lot of us have the native app for Twitter because it works just fine. We don't really think about it. But Twitter Lite uses 70% less data, and it loads 30% quicker. So if you're the user that needs to make these considerations on how much data you're going to use, then you're going to weigh this out. And there's incentive for companies to have both native and progressive web apps. So this will really cater to a specific user group for that reason. And lastly, it's discoverable. Like, we have SEO options that native doesn't have, which is really nice for getting this into more people's hands. People will know how to find it. So not all mobile apps should be progressive web apps. I think there's definitely space for both. But all apps should meet progressive benchmarks. This is beyond discussion of mobile environments. This has a lot to do with what an ideal user experience should look like in our world. So if you're interested in getting started and you haven't, there's a lot of tools available. If you use React, create a React app starts you out with service workers. It's not, it's not fully offline because you still have to build your app on it. But it shows you how to get started with service workers, and from there you can build out your strategies that suit the needs of the project that you're working on. Gatsby also has a lot of resources around offline functionality. It really helps you get on your way without too much cognitive overhead. And as I was making this list, I didn't realize how much of this is already represented in the conference. So there's a Gatsby talk, and then there's another talk, I think right after this, that talks about Workbox, which is a great tool to just kind of like make the overhead of working with service workers a little bit easier. And service workers are really like the crux of it. Like they're not the easiest API to work with, but they are essential. And so Dave Geddes has this game called Service Workies, and you get to like become like a superhero and learn about how service workers work and like how to get this started. So really, there's all the reasons to get into service workers and progressive web apps. If you only just want to end this conference and go play a game, like that's available to you as well. And if you do want to start integrating these features into your app, I would recommend just starting with initial caching of assets, getting that time to interactive up, and improving your responsive design. I imagine most of you already have that as part of your workflow, and considering more nuanced breakdowns to create a more pixel-perfect responsive experience for your users. So they'll feel like are on your app. It's actually an app that was designed for their device rather than retrofitted to the device. Offline functionality, get started with registering service workers and build incrementally from there. And then add the engagements that you think will be most beneficial, like getting the home screen functionality working, or be it access using certain APIs to work with camera or push notifications, whatever it is that you find to be most exciting as it pertains to your project, start working with that. And then start working into more of the progressive web app design. Now, from my past experience, I found that if you just jump into service workers and you get your web app working offline, you're not going to, and you don't communicate that with your users, they might not know to go to your app when the network is down. So having some sort of design that lets them know that they're offline, that this is still working, that they still can interact with your app is really crucial for them to bridge the gap in how they think about your app. Next, make sure you test as you go. It's not fun testing service workers. I would recommend starting with browser unit testing. Integration tests and unit tests are really helpful. It's really easy when you're creating unit tests to create the ideal environment for service workers, and then just think that everything's fine. Don't get stuck in Chrome. I only say this as a compliment to Chrome. They have amazing resources. It's a dream to work in Chrome with progressive web apps, but there's no guarantee that your users are only going to access your app through Chrome. So make sure you're aware of the benefits and like the things that are different in different browsers. So when you're choosing which features you're going to work with, you know what the drawbacks are for users accessing it through Safari or Firefox, for example. Address PWA features frequently and early. If it's something that you tack on at the end of a project, it's not likely to get included. I think that's just true for any cool thing that you want to work on. And it doesn't seem as daunting when you think of your timeline with PWA integrated into it. And then make it a hobby to expand your horizons on what user needs look like in a world where we have emerging markets and expanding users throughout the world. Because ultimately, your work makes an impact, and you have to make sure that it has the reach that your users require so they can benefit from what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Necoline, Hubner. We have questions for you too. So let's start. How is it with Elastic MySQL databases? Do they work with PWA?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
All right, that's totally fine. Is PWA well supported on iOS?
Yes. There are drawbacks to it, but there's a lot of support available for it.
What are the major challenges in writing a service worker?
I think the one thing that most people run into is that they get a service worker working, and then they don't get it refreshing in the right way. So you'll have all of these changes that you're pushing to your app, but the service worker is not acknowledging those changes. So making sure that you have exit strategies involved, like from the onset, that will really help to prevent you from getting stuck in the service worker hell where you don't know why your app isn't reflecting the changes that you've made.
What about user awareness about the PWAs? For example, on the iOS, you cannot even promote it to them, if I'm not mistaken.
So I've heard this in conversation about like whether or not it's in the app stores, and that's something that's actively being worked on. The perception of, or the understanding that they exist is something that we are building towards, right? It's relatively new that we're incorporating this into our workflow, and so making sure that it's prominent on your site, that they can install it, and then once it's installed on their home screen, they don't really think about whether or not it's a progressive web app versus a native app. I think the initial adoption is probably like the big conversation to have, and so letting people know through like your own UX is helpful. I think that would be the place to start.
Great. Which big sites or companies have PWA?
Uber has it, Twitter has it, Trivago has been a really big success story with that. I have like a lot of resources at the end of the slides, so I'll be publishing that. And there's this whole site with PWA stats of what kind of success people have had with progressive web apps. So I recommend you check that out.
Will PWA work well with server-side rendering?
Will it work well with server-side rendering? Yes. Yeah.
Sure. How about PWA and microservices?
I don't really think there's any sort of barrier there. Yeah.
And then last question, how service workers work with highly dynamic web apps?
Highly dynamic in the sense that, I guess, multiple, like you're getting different user interactions, or highly dynamic in the sense that you're getting page loads at different times. I think it depends, but you really just have to pair your service worker strategies with the way that your web app is designed, and maybe start with like the most crucial components of your app and then build out from there.
Great, thank you so much. This is Necoline Hubner.